All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome. I want to welcome everyone to the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture. I am Dr. Tamara Butler. I serve as the executive director here. Hello and welcome. Just want to give you a little bit, kind of like a semi housekeeping. So if you've never been to Avery before, restrooms are there's a restroom on this floor. There are restrooms on the other floors as well. This one is a one-person situation. So if you go in there, don't try to yank the door open. If there's somebody already in there. Also, if you needed to, there's stairs here or the elevator, depending on how you wanted to get up here. And then just a little bit about the space around you. The Avery Research Center is home of what was formerly known as the Avery Normal Institute, which was a school for African Americans, specifically teachers, from 1868 until about 1947. Now we became a high school. In the 90s, we became this beautiful space, which is a research center focused on archives, libraries, and a museum. So some of our team is here today. And so one of our team members is Darren Lee Calhoun II, who's kind of running around. And then we also have Miss Georgette Mayo in the space. She is our processing archivist. And so we want to thank you. Also want to thank all of the community members that are here with us today. So College of Charleston campus folks, as well as the larger Charleston community. And so you didn't come to hear me ramble about Avery and things. You actually came to celebrate our great colleague, Shannon Eaves, and her newest book that is out here into the world. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mari Crabtree for our introduction and conversation. So once again, welcome.
Is this on? It's on. Okay. So thank you all for coming to, it looks like it's afternoon, but it is technically evening. So this evening's African American Studies Faculty Book Celebration. My name is Mari Crabtree, and I'm an associate professor of African American Studies. I am so thrilled that we are gathering to celebrate the publication of Dr. Shannon Eaves' new book, Sexual Violence and American Slavery, The Making of a Rape Culture in the Antebellum South, which will be published by the University of North Carolina Press later this month. The bookstore assures me that there are copies on the way, and so hopefully very soon you can purchase them from Barnes & Noble on Calhoun. To our students, faculty are often understood primarily as educators, since they usually see us in class. But another critical part of our role as professors is our scholarship. We do research, we write, we publish. And our research not only generates new conversations and debates in our fields, but also informs how we teach and what we teach. Publishing a book is a long, difficult process and the culmination of years of work. We don't always have the opportunity to celebrate these major achievements, which is why African American Studies remains committed to taking the time to appreciate the work of our colleagues through our faculty book celebration. Also, I want to make sure before I forget to thank the History Department, Dr. Eaves' home department, and the Avery Research Center for co-sponsoring today's event. So I have the privilege today of being in conversation with Dr. Eaves about her new book, and we will open up the floor to questions afterwards, but feel free to get up and partake in the snacks as we go along as well. Before I start my conversation with Dr. Eaves, I want to tell you a little bit about her and her work. She is a generous colleague with an appointment in the History Department and affiliations in Women's and Gender Studies and African American Studies. But she's also a dear friend of mine and an actual South Carolinian. Her research in African American women's history is as much a reflection of her personal connection to her work as it is her professional commitments to the study of history, the primacy of the archive, and the research of scholars, especially Black women scholars, who gave shape to her field. Her book, Sexual Violence in American Slavery, makes a critical argument to the field of Black women's history, that rape culture played a foundational role in shaping cultural, social, and legal norms in the antebellum South. And her book moves rape culture from the margins of that society to its center. But don't just take my word for it. Hannah Rosen, author of Terror in the Heart of Freedom, Citizenship, Sexual Violence, and the Meaning of Race in the Post-Emancipation South, said that, quote, the insights in Shannon Eaves' new book will shape future discussions of sexual violence and exploitation under slavery, whether focused on the history of enslaved people or histories of white Southern communities and families. This is an important book that promises to be the gold standard on this subject going forward, end quote. So that's a pretty glowing review. And really, unlike other studies that have focused on either the perpetrators of rape or the victims of rape in the antebellum South, Dr. Eaves's book examines the impact of rape culture on enslaved Black women, enslaved Black men, white men enslavers, and white women enslavers to provide a fuller picture of rape culture and its myriad ramifications for each of these groups. Before I turn to our conversation, I'll also say that her approach centers the stories of enslaved people, especially enslaved women, reclaiming them from obscurity in an effort to restore something of their lives in a historical landscape that so often denies them subjectivity and a voice. This is to say that her book has a political stake in making legible the lives of enslaved Black women, and for this alone, her book is a necessary and important addition to the field of African American history. So I've talked a lot. I have some questions for you about your book, and then we can open it up to the floor.
Well, first, can I just take a moment to thank you for organizing this, for suggesting it, and I appreciate you more than you know. And I think and thank you for reminding me of how important it is to pause and to acknowledge, the work that we do and why it's important, and, why we labored so hard, and, why we put in the work. And that should be celebrated. So thank you for creating an opportunity for me to sit in that moment. And I also want to thank all of you all for being here. My home department, history, the Avery Research Center, African American Studies, for your support. So thanks.
So I want to get into the kind of meaty bits of your book. So there's some big questions at the core of your book, and I wanted you to kind of talk about what are some of these big central questions you wanted to answer, and how did you arrive to ask those questions? Like, what process got you to think this is what needs to be asked, and this is how I should go about answering it?
Well, enslaved women brought me to this project. I can take myself back to being a junior in college and reading Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl for the first time, and it resonating with me because it allowed me to reflect on the fact that I am myself a descendant of an enslaved woman, and had the fortune of knowing perhaps more about my own family history than most people of African descent in this country do. And I knew that my grandfather was born in the 1890s, and his father was the son of a enslaved woman and her white owner. And even, she transitioned from being enslaved by the Eaves family in Barnwell County to being their housekeeper in the post-Civil War era. And it was actually during the 1870s that she had the two children by this man named Montgomery Eaves. And so I knew that history, and, reading Harriet Jacobs, caused me to remember that and to sit in that and though I don't know the details of, what transpired between the two of them, it, it made me want to know more about her, Harriet Jacobs' experience, my own ancestors' experience. But as I read Jacobs and I went to the archives and I read other people's stories, I started to think about all of the other people who were involved, and in the introduction to my book, I talked primarily about Frederick Douglass and how he describes the sexual assault on his aunt as he describes it as his entrance into the hells of slavery. He talks about the assault on her and reflects on the trauma that he suffered as a result of being a witness. And so I'm not the first person to write about enslaved women and sexual violence. Lots of people have written about that. But I am perhaps the first person to make an argument that the systematic rape and exploitation of enslaved women helped to generate this larger culture of sexual violence that informed how enslavers as well as enslaved people navigated spaces. And so in the case of Douglass, he talks about watching this assault through the boards of this makeshift closet that he's in, and how he's paralyzed. And I think that he gives voice to the guilt that he felt that he's so young and he can't do anything. And these are memories that he carries with him, throughout the rest of his life. And so that then, started to make me ask questions about, well, how is he experiencing this? How is this going to inform his life, potentially as a father, as a potential partner to someone? How would he engage with his owner from that moment forward? How would he, this assault on his aunt it has reverberations, and I think about the fact that his owner had children, grown children who lived in this house, and grandchildren who lived in this same space that he is carrying out these assaults on enslaved people. They hear the sounds the same way he did, but they know not to respond to them. So there's prescriptive behavior here. People were not just, they weren't just born knowing that they should brace themselves for this sort of assault, that they should just be a silent witness of these sorts of assaults, that they cannot defend their loved ones against these sorts of assaults. They're and so that's the cultural, that's why I say that this is a culture. Sexual assault in this way becomes a tool of power, and it instructs everybody how to be and how to act. The person waging the power gets to say that I'm the one in charge. I get to dictate. And, the people in the wake have to then, find ways to maneuver and work around that. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question.
No, but I think it speaks to the reason why you call it a culture,
Mhm.
right? A rape culture, because it's not just about individual kind of choices. This is something that is not only being shaped by other people's actions, but it's institutionalized,
Mhm.
right? I know you do a lot of work with legal cases. You see how the law is being shaped around rape.
Mhm.
And how, especially groups that we tend not to talk about as
Mhm.
much, like white women and Black men,
Mhm.
are also being impacted by that rape culture. We tend to think about it in terms of direct victims and perpetrators, but there's a much
Right.
richer story to be told.
Right. I mean, that brings to mind, I think about how there's, even other laws, we by law, enslaved women are defined as unrapeable. They don't even fall within the context of the law. Race and gender are written into the law. Only white women are able to be, sexually assaulted in this way. And so when I think about slave patrollers, they come up in people's testimony all the time because, these are people who don't own enslaved people. They are a part of the working class. Their job, though, is to surveil enslaved people and to patrol at night. And so, with that little bit of power that they have, one of the ways in which they express that power is to come onto other people's property at night and sexually assault women and also terrorize men. And that's a part of, it's their job is what empowers them to do that, but it's also about it provides them with an opportunity to engage in behavior that or to exercise a sort of power that other parts of the world are denying them, right? But this is one area in which they can be powerful, they can be seen as powerful. And so there's so many, it's a story that even goes beyond people who even own enslaved people, that an entire culture, a slave system that subjugates blackness to whiteness, this is how it manifests. This is one of the ways in which that manifests.
Yeah, so at the foundation of your book are these stories. I've gotten to read a chapter of it. My copy's in the mail still, but at the foundation of the book are these stories, and a lot of these are stories of enslaved women. And many of them are really defying gendered and racialized expectations, especially in this extraordinarily hierarchical society of the antebellum South. Can you tell us maybe one or two of those stories, like ones that really, are particularly moving for you, or were remarkable for the audaciousness of the woman in the story, or really tragic? Like, can you talk about some of these stories, which really kind of ground the writing in the book?
Yeah, gosh, there's so many. But one particular woman who comes to mind is this woman named Virginia Boyd. I don't, was it chapter 2 that that you read?
I read the one with Douglas at the beginning.
Okay. This woman, Virginia Boyd, she lives in Texas and she's owned by this man named Samuel Boyd, and he's a big time judge. He's a judge, so he's got this position in the legal world. He's also this major plantation owner. He's a business partner with one of the largest slave traders at this point in time. So he's got connections to New Orleans and just all throughout the South, and comes from a very powerful family. He's married into a very powerful family. His wife is also, comes from a really well-established slaveholding family in Texas. And she finds herself in a a slave yard. So she's been put up for sale. And I know that in some ways her sexual connection to this man has given her access to some things that some enslaved women don't have access to. She knows how to read and write. She's found herself in a position to be able to have conversations with some of the men that he works with. She feels at least she at least seizes the opportunity to write a letter to one of them when she finds herself in this jail. And she's pregnant with one of Samuel Boyd's children at that time. And she's accompanied by the other child that they have together. And so both of them have been put up for sale. And so what really struck me in this letter is that she's begging not to be sold. She's begging not to be sold and separated from her child. And she asserts that, you know, with all that I've gone through, didn't that earn me, or didn't I deserve at least some consideration? And she says, but she also acknowledges that she has to be discreet because she understands that that's an important part of.
And who's the letter
this.
to?
The letter is to Rice Ballard, who is the big time slave trader that Samuel Boyd, actually, they own property together. They own plantations, and they're really tied together business wise. And so she knows that he could potentially be able to speak on her behalf. And that's what she's asking for him. Will you speak on my behalf? And she promises that she will not divulge the details of why they are connected, that, she's birthed his children, right? But then at the very end, she says, she flips it and says, essentially, but if I must, I'll tell it, and so then, so for me, being in the archive and seeing this letter that's written by this woman, and watching her do all of the mental gymnastics of, having to say all of the right things, and, having to be deferential in the moments where she has to be deferential, having to account for his wife, because that's who she's really signaling to, right? That, that I won't make trouble for your wife, because if this comes out publicly, she's going to be just, as humiliated, if not more humiliated. And that's why you're going to suffer behind closed doors because of her humiliation. Right. And so it's just, she just reveals all the layers. But even though there's parts in reading her letter, there's parts that are really inspiring to me, that, she is doing such an audacious thing, but there's so much that can happen to her as a result of putting this pen to paper. And then again at the end, when, the letter ends with, yeah, I said I won't cause trouble, but if I have to, I will, in essence. And and I'm sure, what I take solace in is that, in that moment, I'm sure that was that, she perhaps felt some sense of agency for sure in doing that. Um, the unfortunate thing is that the next letter in the folder is one where it is a letter from one of Rice Ballard's employers confirming that she and the child have been sold. So, she is not able to actually prevent herself from being sold. But there's, for me, it's still so important to tell her story, because one of the larger debates that has happened amongst historians who are thinking about interracial, sex across the color line during slavery is, you know, do we consider the possibility that there could have been actual, romantic relationships that formed between enslavers and enslaved women. In denying that, are we denying aspects of either of these, either groups, humanity, or are these relationships just by default exploitative, and just all of those questions. And so, for me, my mission in this was to think about the cultural landscape that these women are navigating, all of the risks, and then shining a spotlight on, what calculations that they did make, what risks were they willing to take, how did they see themselves as agents of power within this larger structure. So, she's one in particular who always kind of sticks with me.
Yeah, that's a really powerful story. And, I mean, like so many of these cases, it ends up with sale, with family separation, with all kinds of other major upheavals in people's lives. But it is extraordinary that she kind of threatened to
Yeah.
expose this man.
At the end of the, I
yeah.
mean, and it made it to the archive.
Yeah, how did it get to the archive? I'm curious.
Yeah, that I don't know. Because I can imagine that there are lots more of these letters that were written and penned over the years, but they get lost, and family members don't want to turn them over. I have no idea how this one survived.
But it was in like the business records for the,
It was in Rice Ballard's papers.
okay.
So he's got a huge
Hmm.
huge archive at UNC, and I mean, it's one of the largest ones. I mean, he was just incredibly wealthy and was responsible for the sale, like brokering the sale of just thousands of people.
I want to make sure I leave enough time for other folks to ask questions. So I'll just ask one more, which is a big one. What do you hope that people who read your book come away with after reading it?
I know that one thing that they're likely going to come away with is that this is a very difficult history. I've been told by reviewers, I've been told by, people in the field that this is important work, but geez, that was really hard to read, and that it has a heaviness. And so I know that that's going to be the experience. And that was a part of the conversation, through the review process is, will people perhaps be hesitant to assign this book to undergraduates? Are they going to be able to handle this, this history? And, when faced with that question, for me, the watering it down, or not shedding light, or, doing the best that I could do to give voice, just wasn't an option. And so I know that what people will perhaps walk away with is a heaviness. But at the same time, I hope that people also walk away with a sense of just how nuanced people's lives were in, during this time, that the sorts of calculations that people had to make, the sorts of threats that people faced, were just so multifaceted, and yet, people still, survived. I mean, I hope that, people also come away with that, just surviving the system of slavery in the US, across the Americas, for that matter, in my opinion, was a revolutionary act, just to survive. is revolutionary in this context. And so, I hope that that's, one of the things that people walk away with, and also having a broader sense of how power worked, and who could wield who wielded power in this environment. We often think about, the male slaveholder, with the whip, but you didn't have to be the the patriarch of a plantation household to be the person who perhaps in provoked, or like instilled the most fear in people. Sometimes it's it's the son who's the person who you fear at night. Sometimes it's the woman of the household who really proves to be your the person who causes you to have nightmares at night. So that's hopefully one of the takeaways.
Yeah, thank you very much. I do want to open it up for questions. I will just hand a microphone to whoever wants to. Okay, John.
So, my question is, I'll preface this by saying that my book ended up going to my house in Tennessee, and my mother read the book and sent it back to me. And my mom said, we've talked about this, Shannon. She said, this was a difficult book to read, but I needed to read it. And she said, what's in this book is true. So my 70-ish mother, who is a nurse, who, while she did academic medicine, she's not in the social sciences, read the book and got the book and understood the message. So I guess I want to move from that to, you said there's a concern that undergraduates might not be assigned this book. So first, my 70-ish-year-old mother was fine and read it and got it. So it's not academic jargon. But secondly, for those of us who may want to use this book in our courses, what are your suggestions? So what can we do to use this book?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that, I think number one, just creating space for your students to be able to talk about why it's difficult, and to number one, acknowledge. I think you have to first acknowledge that it's difficult, and make it very, just establish the foundation that it's okay for history to be uncomfortable. I don't know why. Well, I do know why. I do know why. But history is not comfortable. It's, the present isn't comfortable. So why should we think that the past is comfortable? And so I think, just establishing that, creating opportunities for people to talk about the things that they found difficult to read, I think would be perhaps a starting point. But then also challenging, perhaps, challenging students to also, just ask themselves that question, like, why does this make me uncomfortable? Or, why is this hard to read? And move from there. But then also ask the question, what do I gain though by sitting in that discomfort? What do I now know that I didn't know before? And like, what does this help to inform? So, I think sometimes just creating that, kind of stepping out of the academic side of things and just creating space for just those more interpersonal connections in the classroom, I think helps a lot. I can recall showing my students 12 Years a Slave several years ago, and we had to break it up over the course of 2 classes, but we ended at this particular moment where an enslaved woman is whipped, and I know that I just, in that moment, I mean, you could hear a pin drop. I mean, everyone was just, and I know that I was too, because it was hard to watch. And so I started class the next class period. And I just said, before we move on, let's just take a moment to pause, and let's take a moment to just sit with the fact that because I wanted to provide opportunity and space for us to talk about that, because I didn't think that we should just move on as though we didn't see it, as though it didn't happen, as though it wasn't hard to watch, it wasn't uncomfortable. And so I know I certainly felt better having, done that. And, I hope that my students did as well.
My takeaway is I've already stolen a line to put in my tour tomorrow. Enslaved women were not rapeable. Thank you. And then what you just said about the present isn't comfortable. Why would we expect history to be different? Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
So I know this is a question that several of us have been thinking. I know, Mari, you've been grappling with this, just sort of the ethics of telling these stories, like the worst thing that ever happened to a person and putting it in a book versus the need to tell the story
Right.
so that we can learn something.
Mhm.
And then wondered if you could speak a little bit more to that weight and how you made those choices.
Yeah. I grappled with that a lot. Like many people who, entered into the field around the time that I did, read Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection, where, she does, state very explicitly that, the story of Frederick Douglass and his aunt, that's one that she's not going to recount. And tells and speaks about the ethics of like why she's not going to do that. And I had to grapple with that. I did, and I do address that, in a footnote in my book, to say that that I do that I understand the ethical, the ethical problems of speaking about what is perhaps the worst day or the worst thing that's ever happened to someone. But having, and then my, talking through my own way of thinking about, how can I talk about this subject, but do so in a manner that's going to be generative, but not exploitative. And, and so I think that number one, I felt that it was important for, me to just acknowledge that that was something that I needed to do, and that, that I wanted to do that with as much care as I could. But I did ultimately land on the side of that, I do think that with as much care as possible, that this is a history that does need to be told. And so, one of the adjustments that I did make is that I thought long and hard with like every description of violence. And I found myself taking out, so much stuff. Even when I did my second round of revisions, I just found even more ways in which, and I was like, is this really, I had to ask myself with each description, does this advance my argument? Does this, is this necessary for people to understand the larger implications here. And so, I went through that process and was able to scale back a lot. And so, I mean, I appreciate the fact that these conversations are being had, because I know that there's, in that way, I think back now on like the earliest forms of my writing on this, parts of my dissertation, parts of, other papers that I've written where I didn't do that same kind of work and care. So, I think in that regard, having these conversations with Madi, like, just being in conversation with other people in the field, I think definitely helped to um, help me produce a work that, again, that I know is difficult, but one that I can honestly say that I utilized as much care as I could without losing, without losing what I feel is the important thing that needs to be communicated.
There we go. So my question is about you. So in taking in all of these stories and lived realities, how do you care for yourself in the writing of this book?
Very poorly.
No.
I'm just being honest. I've gotten that question before, and even though the question was posed to me early, and I was told that I should, develop these, some practices, it it inevitably, I still feel like the efforts that I took, I still got bogged down, and I think sometimes in ways that I don't even know if I'm quite yet aware of. And because one thing that I did notice in the writing of this book is that there were ways in which I had really become numb to the subject matter. I can recall being in DC and coming out of the National Archives and, talking to my best friend and telling her, oh, you won't believe what I found. And then I tell her this, what to me, I'm just, I mean, not that I was excited, but but I was, because this research was like, rummaging through a haystack, trying to find just a little tiny palm full of needles, and so, it was just draining and exhausting just in that regard. But, and she just was, just the horrified look on her face with, because she's like, well, what did you find? And I realized in that moment that, you know, that I no longer, have that reaction, because I couldn't, I couldn't continue to do the work if I took myself through that emotional roller coaster every single time, right? And so there's a way in which I think about what what kind of are the emotional costs of doing this sort of work. What does it mean to grow numb to something, right? I've extended myself a lot of grace, because I know that it's not that I don't care. I know that it's not that, that I've lost sight of the horror. I think that just becomes a part of the coping mechanism. It's the way that you are able to push through. And so I I think that when I think about the exhaustion and just the toll that I feel like my body took in writing this book and finishing this book. To me, I do see that as not just a part of kind of the the typical kind of wear and tear that all of us as academics, go through in trying to finish a project. I think I can now say that, some of what I have experienced, some of what I've felt, is the it's a manifestation, I think, of just all of the 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 spectacle and the horror that I've been immersed in for the past decade or more. So I look forward to to hopefully developing some better self-care practices in the future. But I also recognize that I don't know if there's a way to ever make it any easier. I think it's just, one of my mentors, Deborah Gray White, who gave birth to enslaved women's history in the US. She said that she had to give it up, and her next monograph was about Black women at the turn of the century. And then her next monograph was about protest movements in, the latter part of the 20th century. And, she said that was just a part of survival. So, I haven't quite decided, where my scholarship is going to turn, but I am, I appreciate being able to have conversations with people like her, because then it makes me realize that, I'm not outside the norm.
First of all, Dr. Eaves, I want to say thank you so very much for this very important work that you're doing. As a survivor of sexual assault, it is important, and we do need to hear the stories and to also be able to identify with other people's stories. And one of the things I wanted to clarify, that you said that the particular story that you spoke about was that brought about by, is it Rice Ballard?
Mm-hmm.
The story that you spoke of, and that you also said that he documented that story. Is that how you were able to find out about the story you recounted?
So I was able to find out about this story because Virginia Boyd, wrote Rice Ballard a letter.
Mm-hmm.
And this letter, he kept this letter.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, along with the letters between him and the man who was sent to place her on the market. And so they were all just as a part of his business filing, like his his correspondence.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to his archive, if you go to the archive at UNC, the Southern Historical Collection, his files are tremendous, and you've got like receipts, and you've got bills of sale, and you've got just personal correspondence from him over the years.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was just one of many letters that he had kept.
That's interesting, because it's always intriguing to me that some of the enslavers, the documentation that they did, and the extent that they went to in order to keep those kinds of records, it's always, really interesting to me, and that you are able to also acknowledge that. And that's why I think it's important to document and to tell the stories, so that we can see that the rape culture, and we can really have some way to track it. And so that's just as important, to tell the story. So I just wanted to say, I really appreciate you. I'm looking forward to getting your book, and again, doing more with you in particular in this road that you're taking as a journey.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I think, I mean, if I may interject really briefly, I think it's really remarkable too, that people kept the record, which tells you how everyday, routine and mundane these sorts of horrific acts of violence were.
Right.
know.
He didn't think to, and one of the things that's also interesting is that the man who reports to, who sends the letter back to confirm that she's been sold, there are several letters that he's also written to Rice Ballard about other women that Samuel Boyd owns. And he gets to a point where he tells Rice Ballard that he's become particularly concerned about this one woman to the point where he wants to buy her just to get her out from under the control of Samuel Boyd, and I couldn't, I wanted to be able to do more with that. Because he's kind of this middling agent here, but the fact that he's a slave trader, he helps to, he doesn't own the business, but he's a middleman in all of this. But the fact that he gets to a point where, he's like, essentially wants to, in his own way, play rescuer. But yeah, all of these letters survived. And yeah, I mean, you said that best, that it to Rice Ballard, it's like, okay, well, just another letter that Dave sent,
One more in the back? You don't need it? Okay.
Okay. So this Virginia Boyd's letter, I believe, was written in 1857. So yeah, this was, kind of on the cusp of the Civil War.
We can maybe do one more question. Are you sure, Jason, you don't want to ask your question? Okay.
What you were talking about, when I haven't read the finished product yet, but I read some drafts, and I was struck by how this was not necessarily a secret.
Oh,
This
no.
was an open secret, or there was discretion, but I couldn't believe, I mean, it was really I think it's very eye-opening. I think a lot of people, when they read the book, are going to be struck by this. It's in court cases, it's in wills. These guys are writing letters to each other. They're talking to their sons about it. It wasn't, I would have imagined it would have been this very, secret thing going on, but it wasn't really like that. And I think, I was wondering if you could just talk a little about that and what that says about this being such an ingrained part of,
Yeah.
of Southern society at the time.
I mean, quite literally, enslaved people of mixed race walking around were the living, they're the living embodiment of this culture. So it's, there's, I've gotten this in thinking about like white women in this time, the gossip, this is a part of, gossiping about, the fact that, oh, there's that child over on such and such's plantation, and, he's got her husband's nose, and, and so, yeah, it's I think that the speech often has to be couched in things like gossip. That at least helps to acknowledge that it's taboo, but it is still very much the open secret, that you're talking about. So yeah, I mean, but yeah, just the physical presence of the people who were born as a result of these relations are, it's undeniable.
Well, thank you again for sharing your work with us, Dr. Eaves.
Thank you so much.
One of our colleagues who couldn't be here tonight is going to be doing a book talk with you at Buxton on the 17th,
On the 17th.
the day before Cowboy Junkies.
And I think I think Buxton is asking that you RSVP. So if you are interested in that, I can send you the flyer. You can email me and I can send you the flyer to RSVP. And this here is a QR code to UNC Press's website. And I'm not sure if they're still doing their sale, but I know they were doing a sale at one point in time for 30% off. Do you remember the code, Marty?
It says UNCP 30, but I don't know if
Okay.
it's still.
Okay. Okay, great. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and then also they gave a discount code on, yeah, so there's flyers in the back. Yeah, I got my package in the mail last week with my copies of the book. So that's what's in the back there. So yeah, those are not for sale, but there is a flyer and it does have a discount code on it. So good time to take advantage.
Well, I want to say thank you to everyone. We're also live streaming, so that happened. So we want to say thank you, not only to Shannon for this really dynamic book, because I couldn't imagine writing this. I feel like I'd be very overwhelmed. I also want to thank Mari Crabtree for this conversation. I want to thank all of our colleagues and supporters for coming. This is not the last time that you should come to Avery. There's so many events. For this to be the end of the semester, there are events upon events. So hopefully you are following us on social media, following CFC AAST, also on social media, because sometimes they post what we don't get a chance to post, as well as history department. I think y'all are also on Instagram. So following on social media helps. Reaching out, attending events also helps because it let us know that you're interested and that you like what we're talking about. And so from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank both of y'all for this conversation to kick off April 1st, which is Mercury's in retrograde, and it's April Fool's Day. So everyone tread lightly. Thank you so much. Enjoy the refreshments, and we will see you again soon.